Spire of Dawn. Reality twists and reforms, gnawed open by ancient cunning magic. From the darkness comes the skittering of paws and gleams of cruel eyes. The Skaven march to war, and only the elves of the Dawn Spire stand in their way. The Dawn Spire stands at the edge of the Transient Isles, a frontier outpost of elven civilization within the realm of light. These colossal, lazily drifting islands of black stone hang in the air high above an endless azure sea. Many years ago, a powerful chaos sorcerer sought to bring these island heavens crashing down into the ocean. He employed foul sorceries to warp and corrupt a shard of pure realm stone, creating the cursed artifact known as the Stone of the Falling Skies. This profound creation radiated gravity-twisting power great enough to disrupt the primordial magic that held the Transient Isles aloft. Two great island sanctuaries were lost to the depths before the mages of the Eldritch Council managed to slay the sorcerer and disrupt the energy of the cursed Loonstone. Yet for all the powers of elven mages, they could not destroy it. With the fate of their homeland in balance, three great Archmages made the ultimate sacrifice. Together they entered a spell trance, combining their potent magics in order to suppress the waves of gravitational force emitted by the stones of falling skies. None of them would ever wake from this reverie. The Dawn Spire was built to house the artifacts and the three honored mages. A guard made up of Transient Isles, most elite warriors were created to protect it. Yet despite this formidable obstacle, cruel, avaricious eyes in the dark corners of the realms remain fixed on the stone, planning for the day they will harness its fell power for themselves. The Tower of Dawn. Ilarion closed his eyes as he felt the wind rush across his face and send his long, dark hair whipping out behind him. Beneath him, Haraldra dipped her wings. The High Warden leaned into a roll, feeling the pull of gravity in his guts and smiling for what seemed to be the first time in weeks. The Griffin spiraled elegantly before spreading her wings to ride the zephyr upwards in a shallow climb. She let out a shrill screech of satisfaction. "Aye, my friend," Ilnarion nodded, smiling and ruffing Haladra's feathers affectionately. "A finer day you'll rarely see." The blazing sun above them shone down across the Transient Isles. Great pillars of black rock dusted with evergreen fauna. The landmass hung impossibly in the sky above the endless azure sea. The water was so clear that even from his lofty vantage point Ilarion could see shoals of glimmerfish dancing and leaping through the air, their iridescent scales sparkling in the sun. Haladra gave another thrill, and the High Warden smiled. "I see them too," he said. "Perhaps we'll make another circuit at the day's end, and catch a few for supper." The air was split by the blaring of horns. Ilarion's eyes snapped across to where the sun sat high in the sky, silhouetted a tower far in the distance. The Dawn Spire. It rose from the tip of a wide fist rock, one of the smaller isles in the floating archipelago. A sleek and elegant spear of white marble tipped with rippling banners of crimson and corellian. The tower bore the sea dragon sigil of the Spire Guard of the Transient Isles. The war horns had been sounded. They were under attack. But where in the name of Tyrion had the enemies come from? The Dawn Spire's position within these floating isles meant that a conventional army would find it almost impossible to launch an assault here. Haladra was already looping around to fly towards the cacophony, eyes glinting with predatory anticipation. As they drew close, they saw that the rocky foothills of the island were hidden beneath a seething tide of brackish brown that encircled the dawn spire. It rippled and swirled, and within its depths there were flickers of sickening green light. Haladra hissed and tossed her head in disgust, and the smell hit Alarion's nostrils just a moment later. It was the reek of rotten meat, a week-old flesh, a sour, acrid stench that made his gorge rise. Skaven, he spat. Only the devious Ratmen could have appeared so quickly, and with no warning from the tower's sharp-eyed sentries. He did not need to urge Heralda on. She dropped into a steep dive, angling her wings like an arrowhead, her avian eyes fixed upon the rolling grayish-brown mass of rodents below. Ilarion bent low, tucked his lance firmly into his shoulder. The ground rushed up to meet them. He could see the glimmering pinpricks of armor that marked the locations of his men grow in size until they were close enough to recognize their faces. Haladra cut her dive short with dizzying perfection, spreading her wings out wide to swoop low over the heads of the Skaven swarm. Her talons reached out, scything through molten brown fur, deep into flesh before snatching squealing figures up and dropping their broken bodies onto their fellows. Ilarion, carried by the furious power of the griffin's flight, simply held his lance firm as it speared through the massive Skaven. The heavy steel tore through the bodies and skewered flesh, threatening to tear from the elf's grasp with sheer power of impact. Haladra landed in front of the Spire Guard's shield wall, and the graze of her flight was replaced by a frenzied animal fury as she bucked and clawed at terrified Ratmen who shrieked as they scrambled desperately to get out of the enraged beast's way. "My lord Ilnarion!" gasped Ardes. The Spire Guard Watchmaster's face was slick with blood, which seeped from a deep cut that ran from his nose to jaw. There was no warning. They came from nowhere. "Hold the line, Ardes!" roared Ilarion, sweeping his lance out to send several Skaven tumbling to the floor. They must not reach the stone. Looking at the sheer number of the enemy that were pouring from the clusters of rocks at the far end of the island, Ilnarion felt his stomach tighten. The numbers favored the Ratmen. They were an endless tide, crawling forth from every dank hole on the island, befouling his hallowed ground with their venomous presence. Even now he could see the creatures haul forward their foul war machines. Islands of rusted steel and crackling, baleful energy within the surge of gray-brown fur. As he watched, one of the hateful arcane engines spat a globe of vile green liquid into the air. He watched the arc of it, helpless as it flew over the heads of Skaven and smashed into the ranks of the Spire Guard. There was a splintering sound as the globe smashed into pieces, then a sizzling hiss as a cloud of foul vapors burst forth, enveloping half a dozen elves. Their choking death rattles were awful to hear, agonized, half-crazed howls as the corrosive gas burned out their lungs. They would fight until the last to protect the tower and its blessed occupants, gladly giving their lives to prevent the cursed artifact within from falling into the claws of the wretched Skaven. The air before Ilarion twisted and split apart in a flash of light. Haladra shrieked in alarm, rearing her leonine back legs and bringing her talons up to defend against the new threat, whatever it might be. Through the portal of shimmering energy leapt armored warriors. Ilnarion's heart lifted to see them. They were elves, tall and powerful, with sweeping open-faced helms, topped with plumes of royal blue. Each carried a wondrous greatsword in steady hands, and as they leapt from the portal into the enemy swarm, they whirled and spun as gracefully as dancers, bringing those great weapons around in scything arcs that cut dozens of Skaven warriors into bloody chunks. Behind the sword masters came another figure, slighter, and dressed in robes the color of a clear summer sky. He stepped forth, scepter staff in one hand and leather-bound tome in the other, and bowed to Ilnarion. "Greetings, High Warden," he spoke in a sing-song voice. "I'm Archmage Eldorel, of the White Tower of Sonassus. I came to warn you of the vile Skaven presence here." Ilnarion raised an eyebrow. "Well, yes," admitted the Archmage apologetically. "It appears I've arrived somewhat later than I had hoped. Nevertheless, I believe I can assist you in defense of the Dawnspire. The Ratmen must not set a single foot inside its walls." Eldorel turned, working his elegant fingers in a complex pattern, and muttered an arcane phrase. A bolt of searing light spat forth from his palm, and several Skaven dropped to the ground with agonizing shrieks wrapped in flames. The air reeked of burned hair. "The three seers must not be interrupted," said the Archmage. "Should the rat folk get their claws on the stone of the falling skies—" "They will not," said Ilnarion, and there was steel in his words. "Warriors of the Dawnspires, to me! Let us take the fight to the enemy." Lord of the Swarm. Warlord Ripsnick clambered onto the rocks, scampering over two prostrate slave rats, who groaned audibly as his claws dug into their exposed backs. Normally he would have opened their throats for daring to voice such displeasure, but he was somewhat distracted for the moment. His warriors were being slaughtered. They swarmed the enemy spearmen, scrabbling and biting and hissing as they tried to get past the elves' guard and sink their blades into the exposed necks and unwary backs. The elves were too well drilled for such an approach. Using two clusters of rocks outside the tower, they funneled the Skaven assault. They kept shoulder to shoulder, shields raised and locked tight together. Their long spears flashed out, gleaming in the sunlight, and opened throats or drove deep into vital organs. Every shining warrior that fell claimed several Skaven lives in return. "Good, good," muttered Rapsnick, nodding in satisfaction. Those odds he could accept. He turned and hopped off his perch, landing heavily on his unfortunate slaves. "Send in the rat ogres," he shrieked. "Quick, fast! Smash and tear them. Push them from the tower." He could accept a few hundred dead pack rats. They were easy enough to replace. But the longer he waited, the longer the elves had to reorganize and counterattack. He ground his fangs impatiently. He must take the stone quickly, or more stinking long ears would come. Deep, guttural bellows came from behind. He turned to see the rat ogres barrel forward, rippling muscles twitching beneath scarred and patched fur. Clan rats skittered with squeaks of terror as the monsters lumbered towards the elves, swatting aside anything in their way. One of the ogres picked up an unfortunate black-furred wrench and squeezed. Ripsnip snickered at the sound of cracking bones and watched the ogre hurl the broken corpse at the line of elven spearmen, knocking two warriors to the floor. The elves reacted to the new threat with impressive speed. The front ranks pushed forward and held their spears low, while those behind raised their own weapons, presenting the enemy with a wall of gleaming spear tips. That was not nearly enough to hold back the mindless rage of a mutant abomination. They battered aside the spears and smashed into the ranks of elves, sweeping and punching with those mighty fists, crushing breastplate and skulls with every swing. One lifted a struggling elf into the air, and its muscles bunched and rippled as it tore him in two. Blood splattered across the creature's snout and dribbled down its chest. The line rippled, flattered just a step. It was time to join the fray. "Forward, wretches!" he shrieked, banishing his trusty cleaver and spear. "We killed the long-ears, and we take the elf-stone for ourselves. Glory for the Skaven! Glory for the warlord Ripsnick!" The engineer Encrold ambled past, bent back-end and sour-whiskered as usual. His gun crew'd follow, scorch-furred rats in thick leather coats, wearing brass goggles and long-nosed gas masks that made them look like some strange species of beetle. Behind them they held strange contraptions, warp-fire cannons and poison globe mortars. Ripsnick sneered in disgust and hacked up a wet clump of something unrecognizable, which he spat disdainfully on the floor. Now he hated the arrogant clan Scryer, with their stinking engines of war and their wizened, weakling little metal shapers. He longed to open Encrol's scorched-mark throats, but sadly he needed the engineer alive a while longer. "Don't get throat cut, Encrol," he snarled. "Don't let the long ears cut your ugly head off. Ripsnick needs you alive. Needs you to steel hide the elfy stone they keep up there." He jabbed a filthy claw at the marble tower looming overhead. According to his spies, that's where the long ears kept the great treasure. A magic stone that could bring mountains tumbling down and tear great cities from the sky. That was an artifact that should belong to Clan Verminous. An artifact that should belong to the mighty Ripsnick. Unfortunately, he needed the warp magic of Clan Scryer to secure it. Encrol's engineers dragged the Negastone cage along behind them. The magic dampening material radiated an unpleasant, dry metallic hint of static. It made Ripsnick's fur stand on end. "Worry for you, Ripsnick," spat Encrol, with a vicious smirk. "Worry for you." Ripsnick almost regretted blackmailing the wrench into taking part in his raiding party. He consoled himself by imagining the infinite agonies he would inflict on the stunted engineer once he had outlived his usefulness. A chorus of high-pitched squeals of panic distracted him from his reverie. A griffin dropped screeching from the sky, a long-eared rider in white upon its back. The creature cut through the ranks of Ripsnick's venomous horde, and he cursed as he saw torn and bloodied Skaven tossed like rag dolls into the air. "Forward!" he shrieked. "Forward!" His warriors scampered towards the enemy, and he followed along at a safe distance. His mewling slave rats provided a shield of flesh about him. The ground shook, Ripsnick's ears flattened, and he felt the tingle of warm scents in his limbs. The sour smell of spore rose above the blood and terror of battle, and the rabble to his left began to squeal and clamor over each other in an attempt to flee. Elven cavalry struck with the force of a falling star. Clad in binding silver mail, lances tipped with fluttering banners of blue, the horse riders smashed through the disorganized Skaven flanks, leaving chaos and carnage in their wakes. Ripsnick cursed. The momentum of the initial charge played out. The riders were hacking and slashing their way through the milling vermin. They were close now, too close for his liking, and the cursed slave rats were fleeing. He would skin them alive for such treachery. An elven rider came at him, lance lowered and murder in his eyes. Ripsnick kicked the leg from under the Skaven next to him, sending the unfortunate creature tumbling the rider's mount. There was a shriek, abruptly cut off, and the elf in the saddle struggled to readjust his horse. Ripsnick darted forward, viper quick, and sank his cleaver into the horse's neck. It reared, gurgling blood, and waning pitifully. The rider lost his grip on the lance as he struggled to stay in the saddle. Ripsnick aimed his rusted halberd at the long ear's neck. He felt it slide past bone and slice through meat with a satisfying crunch. The lifeless body toppled from the saddle, and a moment later the dying horse collapsed upon the fallen rider. The Skaven lord stepped up to the dead elf and swung his polearm down. Kill the Long-Ears, he cried, holding aloft the rider's sever's head to the cheers of his raiders. Take their heads for Ripsnick, and take their elfstone too. The Swifthawk agents, guardians of the Dawnspire. For centuries these stern elf warriors have kept safe the cursed artifact known as the Stone of Falling Skies. From afar, the seers of the White Tower of Cynarsis kept their own eternal watch over the Dawnspire, ready to bring the might of the Eldritch Council to bear in the face of an enemy assault. The Skaven, Ripsnick's raiders. Warlord Ripsnick's cutthroat warriors are masterful ambushers. Their favorite tactic is to swarm out of concealed knotholes in the midst of an unprepared foe, smashing their battle lines apart with flesh-warp monstrosities or searing the flesh from their bones with vile warp-fire war engines. This was the story of the Spire of Dawn. Sacrifice and slaughter in the war-torn realms of the Age of Sigmar.